Hi there, people, and welcome to this session on racing nutrition. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to be covering off everything you need to know in terms of fueling for endurance sports across all distances. So, who am I? My name is Graham Turner, and I'm the head coach of Fit to Try Triathlon Coaching. I'm a Triathlon Australia certified level 2 coach, and I've been coaching athletes for about 10 years across all distances. I coach athletes one-on-one and coach athletes all around the world. I'm a certified sports nutritionist, having studied nutrition and been providing nutrition advice to athletes for about a decade. I'm also a competitor, having raced all distances, including the Hawaiian Ironman, the 70.3 World Championships, as well as numerous marathons. So why are these three things important and who cares? Well, I'm my own guinea pig. So what I'm going to be going through is not what is spouted in textbooks, but is also based upon my learnings working with athletes and also, more importantly, working with myself. I'm probably one of the few triathlon coaches that actually has their own hematocrit meter to measure the red blood cell count of myself or athletes. So I can understand the impact of training, but also the impact of the micronutrients within their diet. I have a blood glucose meter, so I can understand the impact of certain foods on blood sugar and the impact of insulin. A blood ketone meter to measure ketones within the blood for athletes that are focused on becoming fat adapted or are interested in ketogenic diets. Even a pulse oximeter to measure the saturation of oxygen within the blood to understand the impact of anaerobic sets and the adaptation that we're looking for. I think it's pretty fair to say that on top of being a coach, a nutritionist and competitor, I'm also a nerd. I like to understand the science behind why things work. I should also add that I'm not endorsed or sponsored by any nutrition companies. So all the information that I'm giving you here is what I've learned, and none of it is being paid for or sponsored by any companies. If you're interested after this and want to find out a bit more, you can follow my newsletter via my website at www.fittotry.com.au. Follow me on Twitter at OzFitToTry, my Facebook page, or subscribe to my blog, where I quite frequently publish articles, not just on nutrition, but on anything to do with endurance sports. So let's get into it. What we're going to be covering off is, first of all, the energy systems. It's really important and very commonly overlooked that you need to understand exactly what energy system you're going to be using in the event, what's the duration of that system, and how long and how you replenish that system. We're going to talk specifically about fueling for racing and what are the requirements across different distances. Talk about fueling pre-race, things like carbo loading. Talk about fluid requirements when racing and the impact of dehydration. Talk about cramping and salt. So let's get into it. First of all, energy systems. There are effectively three energy systems within the body. The first one is called ATP, or it's sometimes called the anaerobic A-lactate system. And it's a combination of two chemicals, adenosine triphosphate and creatine phosphate. This stored energy source lasts about 10 to 12 seconds and takes about 60 to 90 seconds to reload. This is the energy system that we use within fast twitch fibers when, for example, we're lifting weights within the gym. Looking at that reload time, it also tells us that when we are looking at doing gym work, based on that reload time, we don't need to spend more than about 60 to 90 seconds recovery between sets in the gym. Because of the duration, it's not that relevant to endurance sports, and it's probably really only relevant from an athletics perspective if we're talking about 100-meter sprinters. Glycogen is our main energy source when it comes to most endurance sports, and glycogen is stored within the muscles and the liver. The more muscle you have, the more glycogen you store, but conversely, the more glycogen you use when you're actually performing sports. This energy source lasts around an hour 40 to an hour 50 if we're running purely on glycogen. And again, that depends on how the volume of muscle and things like that. The crucial fact, though, is that to reload this energy source takes up to 24 hours. So once we've run out of glycogen within a race, then things start to slow down. The lipid or fat-based system is probably our most important system when it comes to endurance sports. Fat is a very dense energy source. There's about 9 calories per gram of fat. So even if we take a fairly lean athlete at 65 kilos and 9% body fat, they still have about 52,500 calories of stored energy there. If we're pushing at a reasonable intensity and burning, say, 800 calories per hour, that means we've got 65 hours worth of energy there, as opposed to our 1 hour 40 to 1 hour 50 within glycogen. So for sports like Ironman, half Ironman, etc., which are obviously longer than that time, we really need to tap into fat as our primary energy source. It's important to note these are not 3 separate systems. They don't work completely independently of each other. There's a significant overlap between these sources. So in other words, as we are burning glycogen, we may also be burning fat. And what changes based on our intensity is the percentage of those that we're actually burning. So for example, we may be burning 50% of fat and we may be burning 50% glycogen, in which case that 1 hour 40 of glycogen, the time available at that level of intensity in simple terms doubles. It's really critical to note though that the body finds burning glycogen very, very simple. So once you start burning glycogen, so if you go out hard within an event, even when your intensity drops, the percentage of glycogen that you're burning still remains higher. So going out too hard in an event like a marathon actually increases the risk of running out of glycogen before reaching the finishing line. Let's talk about fueling for racing. It's really important to know, despite what you read on the back of labels, that one size does not fit all. You can't just go and say, I've got to take a gel on this period. It depends on the event. So you need to look at the event that you're doing and look at how long it's going to take you to actually complete that event, to then work out which energy source you're going to be using. If you're going to be doing something that's less than an hour 45 to an hour 50, it's completely practical to think that you can do that just on glycogen. If you're going to be doing an event that goes for greater than that, for greater than an hour 50, at a high intensity, you can't rely purely on glycogen. And so you need to look at utilizing fat as well as your stored glycogen. It's also important to note that fat burns in a carbohydrate fire. A simple way of thinking about it is you have petrol within your car, but you do require a spark from the spark plug in order to burn it. So in other words, we can't just completely utilize fat within an event. So how many grams of carbs do you need? You hear a lot of common numbers thrown around, like 60 grams per hour or 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. And if you look at the recommendations on most labels, they're typically based around these kind of numbers. To actually work out those numbers, you need to take a step back and understand how much you can absorb of each of those sugars. Within the body, there are 3 types of sugars that can be naturally absorbed, and they are glucose through the GLUT2 receptor, fructose through the GLUT5 receptor, and galactose through the GLUT2 receptor. Galactose binds with glucose, and that's what lactose is that we have within milk. So unless you're planning to do an entire race just running on milk, then that one doesn't become that important. The GLUT5 receptor for glucose, it can absorb about 1 gram per minute. So 60 grams per hour is kind of correct, but it actually needs to be spaced out. Fructose is a little bit different through the GLUT2 receptor. It can be absorbed at a rate of 25 grams per hour. Once you go over these numbers, those receptors actually become saturated and stop absorbing any more glucose or fructose, and that's a really common reason why you get gastric distress. So any sugar that you take in through your gels needs to actually get converted to either glucose or fructose. So one of the most common sugars that you see within gels and sports drinks is maltodextrin. And the reason, to be perfectly frank, is it's cheap. So it needs to be converted to glucose before it can be absorbed through the GLUT5 receptor. Sucrose, which is also common within gels, has to get converted to glucose and fructose. Dextrose is just another name for glucose, so it can actually be naturally absorbed. High fructose corn syrup, which is quite common in some of the US gels or sports drinks, also needs to be converted to fructose and glucose. So any of those compound sugars actually have to go through a conversion process before they can be absorbed by the body. So if I was looking at different distances, if I was doing a 10k run and it was going to take me 50 minutes, then I might take a gel before the start, but typically I wouldn't bother because I'm going to be running that purely on glycogen. If I'm running a half marathon, if I'm running it at a pace that's under an hour and a half, I won't bother taking any nutrition because again, I'm running purely on glycogen. Once I start to get above that hour 45, I risk running out of glycogen. So I'll take a gel at about 14 kilometers in order to top up those stores. For a 70.3, I can't do that on glycogen. I have to actually take in nutrition and work at an intensity where I'm also burning fat. So I'll typically take a gel every 20 minutes right through the bike and the run. For a marathon, now what's been found with running is if you walk a kilometre or you sprint a kilometre, the actual calorie requirements on the body are very, very similar. And that's obviously because the duration is much shorter at the higher intensity. So rather than using time-based, you're actually safer to use distance-based. So for marathon runners, we typically use a gel every 7 kilometres, which means you're carrying 5 gels within the event. For an Ironman, very, very similar to a half Ironman, the only difference is that I will throw in some solid foods as well, just in order to placate the stomach. What I typically do is look at a gel, half a bar like a bonk breaker or something like that, or a banana, and look at every one of those as being worth 20 minutes of nutrition, and then space out my plan across the duration of the event. I would suggest avoid using drink-based calories if possible. And I'll come back a little bit to that on the dehydration side of things. But 2 reasons. First of all, it's much heavier and bulkier to carry and easier to fall off the bike and lose your nutrition. And that's exactly what happened to one of the Ironman athletes at Kona last year, and she then bonked on the run. It also means that in cold weather racing, you may be consuming a lot of fluid in order just to meet your calorie requirements. Just a tip, use peppermint gum for flavour fatigue, especially in an Ironman if you're taking gels and sports drinks and chomps and bars and things like that. After a while, you can get pretty sick of all that sweet taste. So putting some peppermint chewing gum in your bag can really help relieve that. Another tip, use the alert feature on your watch as a reminder. So what about aid stations? Most aid stations these days contain or carry Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola is a very good energy source. In most parts, it's just glucose, caffeine, and caramel. The issue that you have there is that basically you would have to have 300 ml of Coke to get the equivalent of one gel. So if you're trying to do that every 20 minutes, that's a lot of Coke to try and slam down. Also, with the bubbles within the Coke, you may not find that particularly comfortable. So Coke is a good thing to sip at aid stations just for a flavour change, but it's very hard to rely on it as your sole source of nutrition. This may sound obvious, but it's amazing how many people don't follow this. Never use a product you haven't tried before. I've seen this happen with people even when they've looked at the course nutrition and seen that they're using a product that they may be familiar with, like Gatorade, but the fact that they're racing overseas, even the formulation within those particular products can be different. For hot weather racing, you also need to look at those sugars that are being converted, like maltodextrin, things like that. Two reasons there. In hot weather racing, your body is moving blood to the skin to try and cool, so your digestion slows, so the ability to actually break down those sugars slows. The other reason is that converting maltodextrin is an exothermic reaction. It gives off heat, so it can also basically raise your core temperature in a detrimental way. So what about on race week? Well, what typically happens on race week is that the volume drops, but the intensity remains the same. Now, there's a lot of articles around about carbo loading and how you should carbo load for 3 or 5 days and do fasting and things like that. There was a study that was done in 2002 at the University of Western Australia, and what they did was they actually took muscle biopsies of athletes every hour to determine the glycogen levels within their muscles. And what they found was that the level of glycogen after 24 hours of loading didn't significantly increase. In other words, there was no real value in carbo loading any time beyond 24 hours. I would suggest reducing protein within your diet. A couple of reasons there. Your body doesn't realize energy from protein. Technically, it can if you're trying to go ketogenic, but generally it's not going to, and it's going to use energy to digest it. Protein is also typically slower to digest. So come race day, you don't want partially digested food, heavy food like a steak, sitting in your stomach. Use insulin sensitivity. If you do a hard session, for example, a couple of 30-second high-intensity intervals, you increase your insulin sensitivity. And what that means is that the carbohydrates that you eat within 20 minutes of that session are actually stored as glycogen. So by doing an interval-based session, and it doesn't have to be long, it can just be 5 lots of 30 seconds with 4 minutes in between, it actually enhances your body's ability to store glycogen. Pre-race. The purpose of pre-race breakfast is really just to top up those glycogen stores. And to be perfectly frank, unless you're looking at running an event that's going to be using 100% of your glycogen, then having those 100% topped up is not as critical. So in other words, for an Ironman, when you're going at a slightly lower intensity, it's not as critical as if it was, say, an Olympic distance race where if you're a top athlete, you're going to be around the borderline of those glycogen stores. Remember, it takes about 2 hours for your stomach to empty. So if you are eating breakfast before a race, try and eat that about 2 hours before the actual start so that you don't have undigested food within your stomach when you head out on the swim or the run. It may be worth prioritising sleep versus glycogen. So, mentioned for some of the longer distance races, you're not going to be running on 100% glycogen anyway. So, having to force yourself to get out of bed at 3:30 to eat breakfast may actually be more detrimental than any slight deficiency that you would have within glycogen. Gel before an event is an interesting one, and quite often you'll see nutrition companies say you need to have a gel within 10 minutes of starting an event. For longer races like half Ironmans and things like that, I actually don't recommend that, because what you're trying to do is keep your insulin levels down so that you're tapping into your fat stores longer rather than moving into burning glycogen. So before longer races such as a 70.3 or an Ironman, I'll have my breakfast, but I won't actually have the gel before starting the swim. Post-race, it's really simple. You've done the work, you've done the event, you've struggled through, enjoy. So I'm not endorsing that you go out and clean out your nearest KFC. What I am saying though is just enjoy yourself, make the most and celebrate what you've achieved. Let's just talk about hydration. It's a very common belief that dehydration impacts performance. And you'll often read that by the time you're thirsty, it's too late and you're already dehydrated. I'm sure you might also have heard of the 1 hour test, which is where you weigh yourself, hop on an indoor trainer for an hour, ride hard, and then weigh yourself, and that determines how much fluid you actually need to take on board during a race. The facts around dehydration are really quite simple. So in 1992, Gatorade donated $250,000 to the American College of Sports Medicine. The following year, they held a roundtable meeting on fluid replacement, and surprise, surprise, the recommendation for this funded body was 0% dehydration and drink as much as tolerable. The simple fact is that there is no scientific evidence that backs up that dehydration impacts performance. In fact, in a recent study, a number of cyclists were given fluids versus others that weren't, and they were provided that fluid intravenously. The reason being was that there was no placebo effect for the people that were or weren't drinking. There was no difference between the performance of the two parties. In fact, it's interesting to note that in marathons, when the world records have been set and the athletes have been tested afterwards, it's actually been found that the winners are typically the most dehydrated of anyone out on the field. Aid stations in marathons actually were only introduced in the late 80s, and that was at around the 30 to 34 kilometre mark, and it was for emergency use only. It's interesting, since that time, the world record for the marathon has only changed by about 4 minutes. And that also takes into account changes in training technologies, the actual courses now that they're using. The real risk with hydration is actually the opposite. It's hypernatremia, which is where by drinking too much fluid, you actually dilute the electrolyte levels within the blood and the messages can't get through to the muscle. The interesting thing is that the symptoms of hypernatremia actually present like severe dehydration, and there's been a few cases where people have been taken into hospital and then put on a drip because they thought they were dehydrated. The additional fluid actually ended up being fatal. While hypernatremia is obviously a risk, the other simple fact is that by forcing yourself to drink too much is not comfortable. You're going to be visiting the portaloos, you're going to be feeling like you're sloshing around on the run. It's a really simple rule. We're not saying drink a lot. We're not saying drink nothing. We're actually saying is drink based upon your thirst. So if I go and do a race in Thailand where it's very hot, I may drink close to a litre of an hour. If I go and race in a cooler area in Australia, I might find that I drink maybe half a litre within the entire bike leg. But I'm drinking purely based on how thirsty I am, not trying to force down liquids based upon some numbers. Similarly with cramping, there's no link between cramping and dehydration. There's no link between cramping and salt. In fact, in a recent study, what was found was that cramping was not linked to electrolyte losses, it was not linked to dehydration, and it was more thought that it was around neuromuscular control. In fact, it's quite interesting that when they've looked at the blood salt levels in people that cramp, so a study was done within a marathon where they looked at people within that marathon that cramped and people that didn't, it was actually found that the electrolyte levels for the people that cramped were higher than for the people that didn't cramp. So what causes cramping? In the recent studies on cramping, it's been found when a muscle is performing continuously at a load beyond its training. So in other words, if you are working a muscle at a wattage or a pace or an intensity that is beyond what you have trained for an extended period of time, that is more likely why you cramp. Poor technique. If people, for example, overstride, if people have poor core control, so they sit back on the run, even things like incorrect seating position on the bike where they are overloading that muscle, again, more likely why they are cramping. And similarly, a lack of range of motion. So by working a muscle in a shortened range for an extended period of time, it's also been seen to cause cramping. So what do? Increasing range of motion, stretching, stopping for a short period of time. Stopping for 15, 20 seconds in a marathon to stretch out a muscle that is cramping is not going to significantly impact your time as opposed to walking. Change your technique, change your stride length. If you feel like a muscle is starting to cramp, up your cadence, shorten your stride, do something a little bit different so we're changing the range of motion and we're also changing the load within that muscle. I've also found that utilising strength training for athletes also helps for those that cramp, specifically looking at lower rep, high weight compound exercises. For example, doing full squats in a rep range of around 4 to 6 with a high weight. For some people that are chronic crampers, using magnesium also helps alleviate that. So magnesium is a muscle relaxant, helps that muscle from not becoming too tense. Probably one thing I should say is that magnesium is also the primary ingredient within laxatives. So avoid using too much because there are certain muscles that you don't want being relaxed while you're racing. So that's it. We've covered the energy systems where we've talked about ATP, about glycogen and about fat. We've talked about what sugars your body can naturally absorb, glucose and fructose, and how much of that sugar can be absorbed over periods of time. We've looked at how we use hydration, how we do or don't need to use salt tablets within an event. We've looked at how we fuel pre-race, and we've also looked at the fact that after the race, go out and celebrate. If you got any questions, go back early in the presentation where I gave you my links to my website and Twitter. Otherwise, get out there and just enjoy the season.